The bass line from the sound system at Mutiny Hotel vibrated through Al Pacino's chest as he sat in a corner booth, nursing a scotch and observing the controlled chaos of Miami's most notorious nightclub. March 1982. The neon lights painted everything in shades of pink and blue, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke, expensive cologne, and something else, the electric energy of serious money changing hands in dark corners. Al wore a simple white linen shirt and dark pants, trying to blend into the scenery while his eyes catalogued every detail. The way the young Cuban men moved with aggressive confidence, the way they spoke in rapid Spanish punctuated by English curse words, the way they carried themselves like kings of a kingdom built on powder and paranoia. He was preparing to become Tony Montana, and Tony Montana lived in a world Al had never experienced. The Mutiny was where Miami's cocaine cowboys came to celebrate and conduct business. Everyone knew it, including the FBI agents who photographed license plates in the parking lot and the DEA task force that had been building cases for 2 years. But inside, surrounded by palm fronds and expensive leather, the dealers felt invincible. Al had been researching for 3 months, ever since Brian De Palma offered him the role that would either make him a superstar or destroy his career. Scarface was controversial before a single frame was shot. The script was brutal, honest, and completely uncompromising in its portrayal of the American dream corrupted by cocaine money. Al knew that playing Tony Montana required more than acting technique, it required understanding a mindset that was completely foreign to his South Bronx upbringing. He'd spent weeks reading newspaper accounts of drug busts, court transcripts of cartel prosecutions, and interviews with federal agents who'd worked the Miami cocaine beat. But reading about violence and desperation wasn't the same as understanding it. Al needed to see how these men moved, how they talked, how they thought. He needed to understand the psychology that could transform a Cuban refugee into a millionaire killer. The club was packed with the usual mix of tourists, models, and locals, but Al had learned to spot the real players. They moved differently, spoke more quietly, and commanded respect through presence rather than volume. They were the ones who'd escaped Castro's Cuba with nothing and built empires through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an understanding that violence was just another business tool. Al took another sip of his scotch and continued watching, memorizing gestures and vocal patterns. Tony Montana wasn't just a character, he was a composite of every ambitious, desperate, violent man who'd ever believed that America owed him everything and was willing to take it by force. "You're not a cop." The voice came from directly beside Al's booth, spoken in accented English with the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention. Al looked up to see a man in his early 30s sliding into the seat across from him. Cuban, well-dressed in an expensive suit that fit perfectly, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate odds and angles with every glance. The man was compact but carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never backed down from anything. His hands were manicured, his watch was gold, and there was something about the way other people in the club avoided looking directly at him that suggested he was someone important in circles that didn't appear in the society pages. "No," Al said carefully, "I'm not a cop. FBI. DA. Some other alphabet soup trying to build a case." The man's voice remained conversational, but his eyes never stopped moving, tracking exits and potential threats with the practiced awareness of someone who lived in a dangerous world. "I'm an actor," Al replied, deciding that honesty was probably safer than deception with someone who clearly had experience spotting lies. The man laughed, a sound that carried no humor. "An actor. In the Mutiny. Watching my people like you're studying for a test." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "What kind of actor does research in a place like this?" Al felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "The kind who wants to get the performance right." "Performance." The man repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "What are you performing? Cocaine cowboy? Scarface? Let me guess. Hollywood wants to make another movie about Miami, about Cuban refugees who turn into monsters for white audiences to feel superior about." The accuracy of the assessment was unsettling. Al had read enough scripts to know that most Hollywood portrayals of drug dealers were either cartoonish villains or romanticized antiheroes. Scarface was different, it was attempting something more honest and more brutal, but this man had no reason to believe that. "It's more complicated than that," Al said. "Is it?" The man signaled to a passing waitress, who appeared instantly with a level of attention that suggested she knew exactly who was sitting in the booth. "Bring me a Cuban coffee. And bring my friend here another scotch." The waitress nodded and disappeared, moving with the kind of urgency that suggested refusing this man's requests wasn't an option. "My name is Esteban," the man said, extending his hand across the table. "And you are?" Al Pacino." Esteban's eyebrows raised slightly. "The actor from the gangster movies. Godfather, Serpico. I saw Serpico. Not bad, for a movie about cops." Al shook Esteban's hand, noting the firm grip and the slight callus on his trigger finger. "Thank you. So Al Pacino is sitting in my club, watching my people, getting ready to play a Cuban refugee turned drug dealer. How much research have you done?" "Enough to know I need to do more." Esteban's coffee arrived with Al's fresh scotch. Esteban took a careful sip, his eyes never leaving Al's face. "You want to know what's wrong with your research?" Al waited. "You're studying us like we're animals in a zoo. Watching from a distance, taking notes, thinking you can understand what makes us dangerous just by observing our behavior." Esteban set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "But you can't understand what you've never lived." "That's why I'm here," Al said. "To understand." "No," Esteban replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You're here to steal pieces of our reality so you can sell them back to audiences as entertainment. You want to play a Cuban drug dealer, but you've never been hungry enough to risk everything for a chance at something better." The conversation was drawing attention now. Al could see other patrons glancing in their direction, sensing the tension building between the well-dressed Cuban and the actor who'd been watching them for weeks. "You think you can put on an accent and some flashy clothes and understand what it means to be Tony Montana?" Esteban continued. "You think you can fake the desperation of a man who'd rather die than go back to being poor?" Al felt his own intensity rising, but he kept his voice controlled. "I think I can try to honor the truth of that experience." Esteban laughed again, the same humorless sound. "Honor. That's a good word. Very respectful. But honor doesn't help you understand what it feels like to kill a man who's trying to take everything you've built." The club seemed to grow quieter around them, as if other conversations were pausing to listen to this confrontation between worlds. "You want to understand my world?" Esteban asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to know what makes a man like Tony Montana?" Al nodded. "Then stop watching from a distance like a tourist taking pictures." Esteban finished his coffee in one swallow. "You'll never understand my world because you've never had to live in it." But before Al could respond, Esteban was already standing, preparing to leave. Al felt something shift inside him, the same intensity that had driven him to spend months living with police officers for Serpico, the same commitment that had made him disappear into Michael Corleone's psychology. "Wait," Al said, his voice cutting through the club's ambient noise with surprising authority. Esteban paused, perhaps surprised by the change in Al's tone. When Al spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, harder, more direct, with an edge that made several nearby conversations stop. "You think I don't understand desperation? You think I've never had to choose between survival and conscience?" Al stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. "Let me tell you about understanding, Esteban." The club around them seemed to hold its breath. Other patrons were openly watching now, sensing that something significant was happening between the well-dressed Cuban and the actor who'd been quietly observing for weeks. "When I was preparing for Serpico," Al continued, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous, "I didn't just ride with cops and read case files. I went undercover with narcotics detectives in the worst neighborhoods in New York. I watched deals go bad, I saw people die, I felt what it was like to know that one wrong word could get you killed. Esteban's expression shifted slightly, his casual dismissal replaced by something that might have been curiosity. One night in the South Bronx, Al said, his voice dropping lower but somehow carrying to every corner of their section of the club, I was with a detective named Rodriguez, following a heroin dealer we'd been tracking for weeks. The buy was supposed to be simple. Observe and report, no interaction. Al moved closer to Esteban, close enough that their conversation became more intimate, more dangerous. But the dealer made us. Started shooting before we could identify ourselves as police. Rodriguez took a bullet in the shoulder, went down bleeding in an alley that smelled like piss and desperation. Al's eyes never left Esteban's face. You want to know about choosing between survival and conscience? I had to decide whether to blow our cover to save Rodriguez's life or maintain the investigation that could take down a network killing kids with contaminated drugs. The silence around them was complete now. Even the bass line from the sound system seemed subdued, as if the entire club was listening to Al's story. I chose Rodriguez, Al continued. Blew the investigation, lost months of work, but saved a good cop's life. You think that decision was easy? You think I didn't understand what it meant to risk everything for what I believed was right? Esteban sat back down slowly, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching respect. But that's not the end of the story, Al said, returning to his seat but maintaining the intensity that had commanded everyone's attention. 3 weeks later, we found out the dealer we'd been tracking had been selling to kids outside an elementary school. Kids as young as 8 years old, getting hooked on heroin cut with rat poison. Al picked up his scotch, took a careful sip, his eyes never leaving Esteban's face. So when you ask me if I understand desperation, if I know what it means to make choices that define who you are, the answer is yes. I understand what it means to live with consequences that keep you awake at night. Esteban leaned forward, his earlier dismissive attitude completely gone. That's one experience, Al. One night of danger. My world is that danger every day, every deal, every conversation with people who'd kill you for the watch on your wrist. You're right, Al replied, surprising Esteban with his agreement. I can't understand what it's like to live with that level of constant threat. But I can understand the psychology that creates men like Tony Montana. Al's voice took on a different quality now, more conversational but still carrying that underlying intensity. Tony Montana isn't just a drug dealer, Esteban. He's a man who believes the world owes him something, who's willing to take by force what he can't get through legitimate means. He's smart enough to see the hypocrisy in American society and ruthless enough to exploit it. Esteban nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing something in Al's description. But more than that, Al continued, Tony Montana is a man who's afraid. Afraid of being poor again, afraid of being powerless, afraid of losing everything he's built through violence and intelligence. Every decision he makes, every person he kills, every risk he takes, it all comes from that fear. Al leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow still carrying to everyone listening. And I understand fear, Esteban. I understand what it means to be so afraid of failure that you'd rather destroy yourself than admit you're not strong enough to succeed. The silence that followed was profound. Esteban stared at Al for a long moment, perhaps reassessing everything he'd assumed about the actor sitting across from him. You're not what I expected, Esteban said finally. What did you expect? Another Hollywood actor trying to play dress up, thinking you could put on a Cuban accent and some flashy clothes and fool people who live this life every day. Esteban signaled for another coffee. Instead, I'm talking to someone who actually understands that characters like Tony Montana come from somewhere real. Al nodded. The script isn't about glorifying drug dealers or making them sympathetic. It's about showing how intelligent, ambitious men can become monsters when they decide the rules don't apply to them. And you think you can play that convincingly? Al was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think I can honor the truth of what creates men like Tony Montana. I can't pretend to have lived your life, but I can understand the emotions and fears and desires that drive someone to choose power over safety. Esteban's second coffee arrived, and he took a slow sip while studying Al's face. What do you want from me? I want you to tell me if I'm getting it right, Al replied. Not the surface things, the accent, the clothes, the gestures. I want you to tell me if I understand the psychology. Esteban laughed, but this time the sound carried some genuine amusement. You want me to be your technical advisor on being a drug dealer? I want you to help me make sure I don't turn Tony Montana into a cartoon, Al said seriously. I want to make sure that when Cuban refugees see this movie, they recognize something real, even if they don't approve of the choices the character makes. Esteban was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes studying Al with the kind of careful assessment that suggested he was used to making life-or-death decisions about people's character. There's something you need to understand about men in my world, Esteban said finally. We're not evil by nature. We're not sociopaths or monsters. We're men who made choices that seemed rational at the time, based on circumstances you can't imagine. Al listened intently, memorizing not just the words but the tone, the pauses, the way Esteban's voice carried both pride and something that might have been regret. Tony Montana comes to America with nothing, Esteban continued. No money, no connections, no legitimate way to achieve the success he sees everywhere around him. So he chooses an illegitimate way. Not because he's evil, but because he's practical. Esteban leaned back in his seat, his eyes distant with memory. The violence comes later, when he realizes that everything he's built can be taken away by people who are smarter or more ruthless than he is. The paranoia, the isolation, the inability to trust anyone, that's not character flaws. That's survival instincts in a world where your closest friend might be planning to kill you. Al absorbed every word, understanding that he was receiving insights that no amount of research or observation could have provided. But here's what most people don't understand about Tony Montana, Esteban said, his voice taking on a harder edge. He's not a victim. He knows exactly what he's choosing, and he chooses it anyway because he believes that being powerful and dead is better than being powerless and alive. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two men in expensive suits who approached Esteban with the kind of deference that suggested important business. Esteban looked at Al, then at the men, then back at Al. I have to take care of some business, Esteban said, standing. But Al? Al looked up at him. When you play Tony Montana, remember that he's not a monster who became a man. He's a man who chose to become a monster. There's a difference, and if you can show that difference, you'll have created something worth watching. Esteban reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Al. That's my private number. Call me when you start filming. I want to see if you got it right. As Esteban walked away with his associates, Al looked at the card. On the back, in neat handwriting, Esteban had written, "The world is yours, but it will cost you everything." 3 months later, when Al was deep into filming Scarface, he called Esteban's number. They met at a different club, and Esteban watched as Al demonstrated Tony Montana's mannerisms, speech patterns, and psychological progression. That's him, Esteban said after watching Al perform a scene. That's exactly what I was talking about. You found the man inside the monster. Years later, when Scarface became a cult classic and Tony Montana became an icon of American cinema, Al would tell interviewers that the most important research he'd done hadn't come from books or police ride-alongs. It had come from a conversation with a man who understood that the difference between hero and villain was often just a matter of circumstances and choices. The story of Al's encounter with Esteban spread through Miami's underground networks faster than wildfire. Word got out that a Hollywood actor had earned the respect of one of the city's most dangerous men not by pretending to be tough, but by demonstrating genuine understanding of what drove men to choose power over safety. When Scarface was released in 1983, it was initially controversial for its violence and language. But in Miami's Cuban community, the film was recognized as something unprecedented, a Hollywood movie that had actually understood the psychology of desperate men making terrible choices in pursuit of the American dream. Al Pacino hadn't just prepared for a role. He had earned the respect of the very people he was portraying, proving that sometimes the most dangerous research is also the most necessary. And in the end, that respect translated into a performance that didn't just entertain audiences, it forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about ambition, desperation, and the American dream's dark side.